You think you know the story of Vietnam? Think again. Forget everything you have read in the history books or seen in the Hollywood blockbusters. It was all a sweet lie fed to the naive. Picture this scene carefully. The most powerful military machine on Earth, armed with billions of dollars, endless napalm, and fleets of modern helicopters, humbled by barefoot peasants in pajamas. Why did this happen? Because the American generals made one fatal, arrogant mistake that cost 58,000 American lives. They firmly believed war was just simple mathematics. But in the dense jungle, mathematics simply does not work. In this unforgiving green environment, only the true predator survives the night. There was another invisible force out there, a force that history has kept hidden in the dark shadows for decades. These were the ghosts, the phantoms, men who knew exactly how to vanish into thin air without a trace. While the Americans stomped loudly through the forest like elephants in a fragile china shop, these unknown specialists crawled backwards into the unknown. Who were these mysterious phantoms of war? To understand this mystery, we must go back to August 12th, 1966, in the brutal terrain of Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The thick air was so heavily congested you could almost drink it, a suffocating soup of extreme humidity and rotting vegetation that clung to the skin like a second layer of hot sweat. Staff Sergeant Thomas Bulldog Grady forcefully wiped a stinging stream of perspiration from his exhausted eyes, his knuckles turning completely white as he gripped his heavy rifle with desperate anticipation for an invisible threat. For 6 agonizing days, his exhausted platoon from the 1st Battalion had been aggressively smashing through this unforgiving green hell. They were desperately hunting for a phantom enemy that headquarters intelligence swore was hiding right under their very noses. However, they had found absolutely nothing but frustration. They discovered only empty rural villages, cold cooking fires, and the maddening, constant buzz of tropical mosquitoes. But suddenly, the lead point man froze completely still. His hand went up swiftly. A terrified whisper passed down the long line like a sudden electric shock. The hushed voice echoed, warning the platoon of immediate movement at the 2 o'clock position, saying to get down. 40 heavily armed men stopped dead in their muddy tracks, completely frozen in place. 40 modern rifles snapped up in perfect unison, their cold barrels anxiously searching the dense wall of dark jungle foliage ahead. Grady strictly whispered to his tense men, "Stay absolutely quiet and wait for my direct order to fire." This was the exact moment General Westmoreland's grand doctrine demanded, perfectly designing their aggressive response to violently find enemies. The ultimate goal was to completely obliterate them with the overwhelming, unmatched might of American aerial and ground firepower. To the exhausted infantrymen, it seemed like a perfect opportunity at last. It seemed incredibly inevitable that they would finally score a major victory, but exactly 300 meters away, sitting utterly invisible inside a thick stand of green bamboo, Captain Liam Sterling of the Australian Army training team slowly lowered his heavy binoculars. He instantly felt a cold, terrifying knot of pure dread tighten deeply within his empty stomach. Captain Sterling realized he was helplessly watching a horrific tragedy unfold in agonizing slow motion right before his hidden eyes. What the aggressive American soldiers clearly saw was a single enemy scout, apparently limping and heavily panicked, carelessly exposing his frail body near the dark tree line. To the untrained observers, it looked like an incredibly easy target, a wonderful gift neatly wrapped in traditional black pajamas. But the seasoned Australian commander knew much better than to trust this deceptive visual. He recognized the fatal deception playing out before him. Sterling had tragically witnessed this exact theater of violent death a dozen times before in other chaotic combat zones. He knew with absolute certainty that the limping figure was not a panicked scout at all. That solitary man was carefully positioned bait designed to lure the overly confident Americans into a slaughter. Just beyond that quiet tree line, expertly hidden in deep spider holes and intricate trench systems, at least 25 hardened, veteran guerrilla fighters were silently waiting. Their eager fingers were gently resting on the cold triggers of their weapons. These embedded communist fighters were absolutely not fleeing in blind terror, as the American troops foolishly assumed. Instead, they were methodically setting the deadly table for a massive, bloody massacre. The naive Americans were about to do exactly what they had been strictly taught to do back in their sunny stateside boot camps. They were preparing to charge blindly forward with massive aggression and overwhelming noise, foolishly trusting in their superior, high-tech guns to effortlessly win the brutal day against a supposedly inferior and poorly equipped peasant fighting force. They were aggressively hunting the enemy the exact same way a heavy, blunt sledgehammer blindly hunts a small nail. But the experienced Captain Sterling fully knew the terrifying, unspoken truth of this specific type of vicious warfare. In the dense, unforgiving jungle, the loud hunter who aggressively moves forward is very often just a convenient meal delivery service for the actual hidden predators, because the true apex predators of this shadowed domain always moved cautiously backwards, manipulating the entire environment to their ultimate tactical advantage against the loud invaders. This brutal, unseen reality was the harsh, defining characteristic of the Vietnam conflict in 1966. When the elite Australian military advisors first arrived in this beautifully war-torn land, they absolutely did not find a sophisticated, highly adaptable Allied fighting force perfectly ready for complex counterinsurgency operations. Instead, they quickly found an arrogant American military machine that was stubbornly geared to fight the massive, conventional battles of World War II all over again in the dense jungle. They brought heavy steel tanks into swamps that swallowed them whole. The mighty American forces brought vast fleets of loud helicopters that announced their arrival from miles away, and they tragically brought an unshakable, almost religious, fanatical belief in the supreme god of overwhelming explosive firepower. But this incredibly blind, institutional confidence was rapidly about to lead these brave young men directly into a horrific, inescapable trap. It was a deadly tactical snare that absolutely no sheer amount of dropped incendiary napalm could ever possibly burn their desperate way out of, exposing a deeply broken and fundamentally flawed military combat machine. To truly understand why the absolute most powerful standing army on the entire planet was blindly walking directly into total disaster after disaster, you must carefully look deep into the rigid mind of the giant, Major General William Westmoreland. The confident man firmly holding the powerful reins of the American war machine was a strict believer in simple, cold, unemotional mathematics. In a heavily classified briefing presented to senior Pentagon officials back in 1965, he practically radiated an aura of terrifying, unyielding confidence regarding his upcoming military campaign plans. Westmoreland famously and arrogantly declared to his superiors that the mighty United States military would simply and easily out-guerrilla the native guerrilla fighters. His strategic logic was incredibly seductive in its stark, straightforward simplicity. He firmly argued that America possessed vastly more bullets, significantly more bombs, and infinitely more financial money. He confidently told the press that if the military could simply kill the enemy fighters much faster than they could possibly be replaced, eventually the communist forces would completely lose their will and quickly quit the bloody armed conflict. It was a brutal, heartless strategy of pure, grinding attrition, a truly grisly calculus of mass death that coldly treated breathing human beings like mere, disposable numbers plotted on a bureaucratic spreadsheet. But the ancient, silent jungle simply does not care about your neat, orderly mathematical spreadsheets. The established American infantry doctrine was fundamentally built entirely upon the rigid concept of movement to contact. This essentially meant aggressively conducting extremely loud, highly visible armed patrolling operations specifically designed to intentionally provoke a massive, violent firefight with the deeply hidden enemy forces. The standard combat units would march loudly in very long, predictable columns, deliberately attempting to forcefully trigger a hidden enemy ambush. The entire absurd point was just so the rest of the surviving unit could quickly maneuver and frantically call in massive, overwhelming artillery and aerial airstrikes. Think deeply about the sheer, horrific insanity of that official military strategy for a brief moment. The accepted battle plan was quite literally to use their own brave, young American soldiers as disposable human tripwires to simply locate the invisible, waiting enemy forces. You do not hunt a tiger by banging a loud drum. Instead, you must become the tiger yourself. This was the fundamental philosophy driving a small, elite cadre of Australian and British officers, who began to pull apart their own military doctrine with surgical ruthlessness. The early reports from Malaya had looked eerily similar to the unfolding disaster in Vietnam. Large, heavily equipped sweeps went out with massive fanfare and predictably came back with a grim list of casualties. The heavily equipped units looked clumsy and half-blind against an opponent who moved like smoke. Faced with the slow erosion of credibility and lives, these foreign specialists stripped away heavy webbing, shiny buckles, loose metal, and noisy kit from their patrol loads. They fully understood that every metallic clink could act as a deadly beacon in the dark tropical environment. Smoking on operations was strictly banned, not for health reasons, but because a single lit cigarette could betray a covert position over hundreds of meters in the still, humid air. Spoken commands completely gave way to subtle hand signals and light touches on the shoulder, ensuring utter silence. These meticulous adjustments turned groups of ordinary men into silent, moving shapes that veterans later described with a single, chilling word. Australian officers captured the new creed in incredibly stark terms. In conventional war, the traditional army chased a highly visible opponent across open fields and paved roads. But in this suffocating jungle war, the successful fighter became an almost invisible presence, patiently allowing the overconfident enemy to blunder blindly into a terrifying web of hidden observation and deadly fire already woven around him. Aggression did not disappear. It was just heavily delayed. Aggression was carefully delayed until the tactical odds were overwhelmingly in their favor. But even this extreme standard of discipline and self-control was only the surface of their methods. Underneath it, a darker and vastly more intricate technique was steadily taking shape. At the very core of the Australian method sat what they began to call counter-tracking. On official paper, it simply looked like ordinary trail following, the sort of basic skill any standard infantryman might be briefly taught in a safe training area. In brutal practice, it became a highly developed science. Trained trackers read the disturbed ground the exact same way experienced detectives meticulously read a bloody crime scene. The specific depth of a heel in soft mud instantly hinted at the heavy weight of the load on a man's back. The sharp angle of a broken twig silently signaled the direction of travel and sometimes indicated obvious haste or extreme caution. A faint smear on a rock that was still damp placed a moving group at that exact spot within a few short hours. Altered spiderwebs and trampled insects all fed into a mental ledger. This continuous story of movement and habit meant a narrow jungle path stopped being a simple line on a map and rapidly turned into a moving biography of the desperate people who heavily used it. The truly radical element was the underlying purpose behind this incredibly close reading of the land. Instead of racing loudly along a trail in the naive hope of catching up and forcing a massive firefight, Australian patrols often followed the enemy for days at a strictly controlled, unseen distance. They were absolutely not hunting isolated individuals in the fleeting moment. They were hunting routine itself. They systematically identified which hidden streams and ponds were indispensable water points, which clearings served as habitual rest sites, and which rural villages acted as reliable sources of food and shelter. They actively learned exactly when supply groups tended to move, at what specific pace, and how they reacted to perceived danger. Once those patterns were known and confirmed, deadly ambushes were absolutely not thrown together at the last panicked minute. They were carefully laid far in advance at tight bottlenecks where desperate escape would be the most difficult. Counter-tracking in its mature, perfected form was entirely about stepping into tomorrow well before the enemy ever physically arrived there. When the Australian Army training team first landed in South Vietnam in the year 1962, it brought much more than pristine uniforms and shiny rank slides. The very first wave, roughly 30 officers and warrant officers, quickly acquired the unofficial and legendary label, the 30 Originals. They were definitely not academic theorists arriving with untested, abstract ideas. They were lethal practitioners of a nasty, patient craft honed in the bloody jungles of Southeast Asia. Their official mandate was merely to advise and assist the local forces. But in harsh reality, they had a much sharper mission: to urgently inject the hard-won Malayan experience into a fresh new conflict before the exact same old mistakes permanently turned into another slow-motion disaster. What they immediately saw in province after province had a highly disturbing sense of déjà vu. American and South Vietnamese units were constantly conducting massive, loud, helicopter-borne sweeps strictly based on neat grid squares and overly optimistic briefing slides. To the ghosts, it was utter madness. Rotor noise loudly announced these operations long before the very first American boot ever forcefully hit the contested ground. Massive artillery blindly smashed massive holes in the empty jungle, and the seasoned guerrilla units simply stepped aside into the shadows until the fiery storm had safely passed. Within mere days, the insurgents were right back on the exact same hidden tracks, using the exact same base areas, acting as if absolutely nothing had happened. The frustrating American obsession with raw body counts clashed head-on with the quiet, intelligence-driven Australian philosophy of surgical warfare. In the deeply flawed eyes of many United States commanders, military success was just a simple, arbitrary number. How many enemy fighters had been aggressively neutralized in a given bloody week? The Australians, heavily shaped by a grueling decade of brutal counterinsurgency, put entirely different figures at the very top of their priority list. A single, breathing, live tax collector, a lowly courier, or a local treasurer could, in practical reality, be vastly more valuable than an entire eliminated platoon of nameless riflemen. Malaya had deeply taught them how underground networks truly survived. These invisible movements survived exclusively on food, money, and raw fear. If the specific people who tightly controlled those vital logistical flows could be quietly seized and forcefully persuaded to talk, the entire invisible network could be accurately mapped and then systematically attacked with far more devastating precision. That exact philosophy led directly to one of the most utterly striking, perfectly executed operations of the early Australian involvement. It became known as the Phantom Abduction in the heavily infiltrated village of Hoa Long, deeply embedded within the dangerous territory of Puok Tui province. By mid-year 1966, weeks of silent observation, nervous informant tips, and meticulous trail analysis had firmly convinced the Australian advisors of a critical vulnerability. A highly senior Viet Cong tax official was actively using Hoa Long as an extremely discreet overnight stop on his vital collection routes. This man was definitely no frontline expendable fighter, but a highly critical financial node directly responsible for constantly channeling massive amounts of rice, livestock, and extorted cash from terrified local peasants directly into the wider, incredibly hungry guerrilla war machine operating in the dark jungle. Eliminating this specific target in a massive, fiery aerial bombardment would certainly cause some temporary logistical disruption. However, successfully capturing him alive promised something vastly more valuable to the intelligence effort. It promised real names, hidden places, and established routines that could absolutely never be guessed from an aircraft flying high above the dense canopy. Where a standard American staff officer might have hastily proposed a loud cordon and search operation heavily backed by destructive artillery, the patient Australians simply put 4 names on a short list and marked a single moonless night. Shortly after dusk on that chosen October evening, a highly trained 4-man Special Air Service patrol quietly slipped out from its secure forward base. Their faces were darkly camouflaged, their lethal weapons carefully wrapped to prevent any accidental glint or metallic rattle. Every loose strap was heavily taped down until absolutely nothing moved except soft cloth and silent flesh. They slowly moved towards Hoa Long, not marching along the open dirt road, but carefully wading along deep irrigation ditches and heavily flooded rice paddies. Thick mud and dark water swallowed the sound of each step. The absolute greatest danger waiting on the muddy outskirts of the sleeping village was not heavily armed guards standing with loaded rifles. It was the rangy, unpredictable local dogs that slept lightly under the wooden houses and loudly barked at anything unfamiliar in the dark. Utilizing the shifting wind direction, a light tropical rain, and sheer, agonizing patience, the specialized team completely halted every single time a wild dog slightly lifted its head or shifted uneasily. They only resumed advancing incredibly slowly when the suspicious animal finally settled back down into the wet dirt. To an uneducated observer watching from a safe distance, the flooded paddies would have appeared completely empty and undisturbed. In terrifying reality, 4 heavily armed men were silently crossing them meter by agonizing meter. By absolute midnight, the stealthy patrol had successfully reached the low, dark cluster of wooden houses right at the village center. They already completely knew from intensive prior reconnaissance exactly which specific hut the wanted tax collector heavily favored when he secretly passed through the area. It was a very simple wooden structure perched upon short, slightly rotting stilts. 2 highly trained members of the silent team carefully positioned themselves at strategic vantage points, completely overlooking the narrow dirt lanes, intensely watching for any slight sign of sudden movement. The remaining lethal pair gently eased their cautious way right up the wooden steps, carefully testing each individual plank to avoid creating any betraying noise. The front door was conveniently unlatched, as was fully expected in the suffocating tropical heat. A steady, highly controlled physical pressure slowly opened it just enough to quietly admit a human body without setting off a loud squeal. Inside the dark hut, the stale air was incredibly thick, with the distinct smell of sour sweat, cheap oil, and old cooked rice. On a slightly raised wooden platform, directly beneath a slack, dirty mosquito net, lay the deeply sleeping tax collector and his terrified wife. The extremely dim ambient light that slowly seeped through the small gaps in the thin walls was just enough for highly trained eyes to instantly locate bodies and unseen obstacles. A thick cloth suddenly went completely over the target's mouth at the exact instant his tired eyes flickered open. The heavy cloth completely smothered any desperate attempt at a loud cry for sudden help. His struggling arms were violently pinned down, and his kicking ankles were rapidly immobilized with terrifying, practiced speed. The shocked woman completely froze in place, shocked into absolute silence by the sudden, overwhelming, and terrifying presence of armed strangers deeply violating her most private, secure space. In a mere matter of a few chaotic seconds, a vastly powerful local communist functionary had been abruptly reduced to a heavily gagged, tightly bound figure, completely removed from his secure network. Outside in the dark, the two covering soldiers constantly scanned the quiet lanes and empty doorways, extremely alert for any unexpected flashing lights or approaching figures. Every single extra heartbeat spent lingering inside the hostile village aggressively multiplied the severe risk that a wandering child, a drunk laborer, or a restless armed guard might accidentally stumble directly into the chaotic scene. With the valuable prisoner fully secured, the team quickly moved him completely out of the small hut, carefully keeping his bound body extremely low to the wet ground, completely breaking his human outline. The chosen route completely out of Hoalong absolutely did not simply retrace their initial entry track. It sharply cut along an entirely different set of dark gaps between the sleeping houses and then went directly back into the same waterlogged rice fields. This was done specifically to totally avoid any suspicious eyes that might now be nervously pointing in new directions after a restless, disturbed night. Once safely back in the flooded paddies, the thick water and soft mud heavily helped to completely swallow what little splashing noise the forced, rapid march created. By the exact time the very first roosters began to loudly crow in Hoalong, the feared taxman was completely gone. He was rapidly heading to a highly distant, secure intelligence compound, where entirely different kinds of extremely difficult questions eagerly awaited him. At bright dawn, the sudden, unexplained absence of the powerful official immediately triggered deep confusion, then rising alarm, and finally a kind of completely hushed, terrifying panic among those who fully understood his critical role. There were absolutely no massive bomb craters blasted into the main dirt street. There were no burnt, ruined houses, and absolutely no bloody bodies laid out neatly for a morbid press counting. There was merely a terrifying, empty space, exactly where a deeply feared and highly necessary figure had been peacefully lying the previous night. Local Viet Cong cadres angrily arriving much later to intensely investigate found absolutely no twisted shell fragments to photograph for propaganda. They found no shiny cartridge cases to collect and absolutely no obvious, telltale sign of a massive, violent military raid conducted on the standard, highly destructive Western combat model. The only plausible conclusion was also by far the absolute most incredibly disturbing to the guerrilla forces. Highly hostile, invisible forces had somehow penetrated incredibly deep into what was strongly supposed to be totally safe, heavily guarded territory. For a vast underground movement that heavily thrived on constantly projecting total, undeniable control in its secure base areas, this was a massive, devastating psychological shock that absolutely no printed propaganda leaflet could ever easily erase. But this was merely the very first violent tremor radiating from that one brilliantly executed, incredibly silent intelligence operation. By early 1967, the quiet Australian military experiment in South Vietnam was rapidly about to absolutely collide head-on with established American combat doctrine. This monumental collision had a very concrete human face in the deeply frustrated form of Captain Jonathan Hughes. He confidently commanded a heavily armed United States infantry battalion and had been actively deployed in country for 4 completely exhausting months. His infantry company had aggressively walked dozens of so-called search and destroy combat patrols through the treacherous, humid environment. Yet, the invisible enemy in his assigned area seemingly continued to heavily multiply like tropical mosquitoes. This infuriating multiplication happened absolutely no matter exactly how many bloody enemy bodies the ambitious American staff officers happily logged in their daily statistical report. On the humid morning of January 8th, near the muddy, brown flowing waters of Suda Creek in Phuoc Tuy Province, Hughes heavily walked into a morning briefing. He was fully expecting another boring, mandatory lecture about arbitrary body counts and standard radio communication procedures. Instead, he shockingly found an Australian Special Air Service intelligence officer calmly spreading detailed reconnaissance photographs of bent green grass and wet stones across a flimsy wooden field table. What immediately followed in that stuffy tent would permanently become a classic textbook historical case of how a profoundly loud, incredibly confident conventional army was brutally forced to admit a harsh truth. They had been arrogantly moving through the dangerous jungle, completely blind to their surroundings. The seasoned Australian, Captain Daniel Grandin, absolutely did not waste his precious breath on abstract military theory. He calmly laid out sharp close-up images of freshly snapped wooden twigs at low ankle height. He pointed out discolored wet mud smeared on green leaves and a highly distinct series of fading boot marks. These distinct tracks grew progressively deeper along a very narrow, hidden dirt track. To a completely untrained American infantry eye, it was just meaningless background jungle noise. To a highly skilled counter-tracker like Grandin, it was a detailed, signed confession perfectly written by an entire Viet Cong logistics unit. The obvious physical pattern clearly showed desperate men carrying progressively heavier supply loads. They were strategically taking vastly easier branches of a sudden fork in the road. They were actively avoiding required tactical detours and consistently passing a very particular geographical point in the early, dark pre-dawn hours. Within a few short hours of that incredibly eye-opening briefing, Grandin confidently led a quiet mixed patrol directly back over the exact same ground Hughes's own company had loudly stomped through only days before. They advanced agonizingly slowly, covering vastly less than 300 meters in the entire first hour. They rigidly stopped every 10 agonizing minutes for complete, silent visual observation of the surrounding dense foliage. By humid midday, they had expertly followed a hidden trail that conventional American doctrine would have completely dismissed as entirely stale, getting incredibly close to a massive, heavily concealed supply cache. This secret area was heavily stocked with precious stolen rice, explosive ammunition, and stolen medical supplies. Instead of foolishly charging straight at it with loud guns blazing, the patient Australians simply marked the exact grid location. They meticulously studied the most likely enemy escape routes and then silently pulled back into the dense shadows. They allowed distant artillery planners and another incredibly small, quiet unit to perfectly set up a highly controlled, devastating strike. 2 quiet days later, perfectly coordinated high-explosive fire and a completely devastating, short, sharp ground movement totally shattered the enemy depot in minutes. This surgical, overwhelming strike successfully seized literally tons of desperately needed food and military material with absolutely no friendly combat casualties and minimal civilian collateral damage. For the deeply humbled Captain Hughes, the sudden psychological shock was utterly brutal. The enemy logistics column had been actively moving almost entirely within easy earshot of his own earlier, heavily armed patrols. The Viet Cong had brilliantly been using the massive noise of heavy American combat boots and loud helicopter turbine engines as a perfect acoustic cover to easily slip completely past his hunting men. His unit had been totally useless. His heavily armed company had effectively been a massive steel hammer blindly swinging in completely empty tropical air. The skilled Australians had physically shown him exactly how to silently watch the throwing arm, not the bloody impact point. It was a massive revelation of complete tactical failure, heavily dressed up as a glorious operational success. Among the deeply shocked American officers who secretly saw the classified after-action notes, a new, humbling phrase began to constantly circulate. They quietly admitted, "We have literally been walking right past them." This painful realization strictly demanded that something incredibly fundamental had to aggressively change. The agonizing tactical transformation that slowly followed in highly select American infantry units was absolutely not glamorous or exciting. It was incredibly tedious, deeply humiliating, and entirely physically draining for the proud men involved. Standard combat patrols that had strongly prided themselves on aggressively covering 4 to 6 entire kilometers a day were strictly ordered to instantly cut their overall daily movement to merely 1 or 2 short kilometers. This massive reduction featured strictly enforced, agonizingly long tactical halts purely for completely silent listening and deep visual observation of the surrounding dense jungle environment. Everything had to completely change. Every single piece of standard-issue military equipment was heavily taped or tightly tied down. This extreme measure was taken until a standard 30-man infantry unit could finally move completely through thick bamboo and tall elephant grass, making significantly less noise than a single, careless, loud soldier had foolishly made just a few short months earlier. Standard metal canteens were strictly half-filled with water to completely stop any loud sloshing sounds. Shiny metal belt buckles completely disappeared under thick layers of dark cloth. Standard operational procedures began to aggressively include very strange, highly paranoid daily combat instructions. Soldiers were constantly told to always strictly assume they were actively being tracked by unseen hostile forces. They were taught to constantly plan exactly how to violently turn the strategic table on the hidden enemy tracker. For an aggressive military culture entirely raised on incredible speed and massive, overwhelming aggression, being forcefully told to constantly think exactly like terrified prey so that they could eventually become significantly better jungle predators was a very bitter, incredibly hard tactical pill to swallow, but the highly adaptable units that successfully swallowed it actually started to happily report significantly fewer deadly ambushes suffered. If the complex intellectual part of the massive tactical shift was incredibly hard, the sheer physical discipline heavily required at the absolute sharpest, most dangerous edge of the brand new combat tactics heavily bordered on the utterly inhuman, deeply hidden in the unforgiving, steep hills of a dangerous, highly contested border province, an elite, highly secretive Australian military sniper detachment, officially codenamed the Geckos, perfectly demonstrated this. They brutally showed exactly how incredibly far this terrifying ghost doctrine could actually go when a highly valuable, strategic human target truly justified the massive physical risk and the immense suffering involved. Highly sensitive, classified intelligence gathered from multiple deeply embedded sources strongly indicated a massive opportunity. A very senior North Vietnamese army general, directly responsible for aggressively coordinating massive military operations completely across an entire strategic region, periodically used a very narrow, deeply hidden jungle saddle. He frequently utilized it as a highly convenient, extremely secret tactical shortcut completely between two supposedly secure communist base areas. The predicted time window was incredibly vague, supposedly happening sometime within a massive 3-day span, most likely occurring in the extremely dark, early morning hours. A conventional quick strike patrol would fail completely. A loud American quick strike patrol would have been completely forced to wildly guess the timing and move incredibly fast, totally advertising its aggressive military presence to the entire jungle. The incredibly patient geckos consciously chose an entirely different, vastly more painful tactical route. They silently moved directly onto a heavily muddy, incredibly steep dirt ridge, completely overlooking the hidden jungle saddle. They expertly camouflaged themselves entirely as a natural part of the wet slope and then completely stopped physically moving almost entirely. For 72 agonizingly long, incredibly painful hours, the tiny 3-man sniper team lay completely pressed down. They were forcefully pressed directly into the cold, incredibly wet earth, their shivering bodies completely blending deeply into the natural contour of the muddy hillside. Heavy tropical rain completely soaked their dark military uniforms. Thick, nasty mud slowly crept directly into absolutely every single fold of wet fabric. Biting tropical insects aggressively swarmed directly into their vulnerable eyes, exposed ears, and open shirt collars. When they desperately needed to relieve themselves physically, they simply did it exactly where they silently lay. They completely accepted the horrific, disgusting filth as the extreme required price of remaining entirely, utterly undetected. Aggressive fire ants and incredibly thirsty blood leeches happily crawled completely freely, directly across their exposed, sweat-soaked human skin, including their highly sensitive, vulnerable eyelids. But absolutely any desperate, entirely natural human attempt to simply brush the painful, biting insects away heavily risked a massive, betraying physical twitch. This tiny human movement would be incredibly visible directly from the hidden enemy trail, closely situated directly below their hidden position. They expertly slowed their human breathing and incredibly reduced their subtle physical movements until even the highly trained, aggressive guard dogs brought along by the heavily armed NVA security forces failed. These living, breathing canine biological sensors simply sniffed the damp tropical air and completely moved on down the hidden trail without reacting aggressively. For 3 incredibly long, completely dark nights, they patiently watched the distant stars slowly drift completely through tiny gaps in the massive green jungle canopy and absolutely saw nothing of their valuable human quarry. Yet the incredibly strict military order strongly held firm in their minds. Absolutely no physical movement, absolutely no tactical repositioning, and absolutely no childish impatience. Shortly after a bright, foggy dawn on the final third day, the target finally physically appeared below. A very small, incredibly heavily armed column came slowly winding directly along the narrow jungle saddle. There was a highly visible cluster of significantly better dressed, older military officers carefully positioned right in the middle, completely under extremely heavy, alert tactical security. From their perfectly concealed, incredibly muddy firing position located only 20 meters away, the hidden geckos silently observed the subtle body language and strict physical spacing. They waited until they were completely confident exactly which specific individual man was the commanding general. One incredibly carefully measured, absolutely perfect shot from a highly suppressed, deadly sniper rifle echoed quietly. That single bullet violently ended his entire military career in one devastating instant. The extremely rapid second flying round immediately sowed absolute, terrifying confusion completely among the heavily armed protective escort. They desperately threw themselves wildly towards the perceived, entirely incorrect direction of the sudden danger, frantically firing blindly into empty trees and hard rocks. By the exact time they finally thought to desperately search much higher, completely up the steep, muddy slope, the legendary snipers had absolutely already begun a perfectly rehearsed, incredibly silent exfiltration straight down the completely blind, safe backside of the steep, muddy ridge. They expertly left completely behind absolutely nothing but slightly disturbed wet mud and a terrified group of highly stunned, deeply traumatized survivors desperately trying to process the violent event. The terrified guards were wondering exactly how a quiet, seemingly empty hillside had seemingly completely come to violent, bloody life actively against them. It was a completely pure, entirely terrifying distillation of the infamous ghost doctrine. It involved truly unimaginable physical discomfort, absolute total silence, and then one incredibly clinical, perfectly violent act that aggressively sent massive shockwaves significantly far beyond the few extremely short seconds of actual, deadly firing. By late 1967, the quiet war over hidden supply lines had aggressively entered a terrifyingly new and highly lethal phase. As more American military units carefully absorbed these ghost tactics, the cold combat statistics in certain dangerous parts of South Vietnam slowly began to change shape. These distinct changes occurred in incredibly dramatic ways that even the most highly skeptical staff officers sitting safely in Saigon could absolutely no longer ignore or dismiss. Infantry companies that had previously reported only sporadic, chaotic contact and suffered regular, heavy casualties from hidden enemy ambushes started drastically reversing the grim tactical narrative entirely. They slowly started bringing back incredible operational figures that sounded almost entirely fictional to the conventional military leadership. In the bloody period from mid-year 1967 to early 1968, the specialized American battalions that had actively trained closely with elite Australian military advisors recorded astonishing average engagement kill ratios. These heavily verified tactical ratios suddenly skyrocketed to around 18-1, strictly in their overwhelming favor, representing more than triple their previous combat performance. At the exact same time, their own tragic casualty rates from sudden surprise attacks and hidden booby traps significantly dropped by as much as 70%. At completely dark, exactly 04:15 hours, in the pitch-black jungle of April 23, 1967, the agonizing waiting finally ended. For a full day and a half, Lieutenant Michael Burhoff's exhausted infantry platoon had been completely lying in the heavily dripping green undergrowth. They were expertly positioned directly along a very narrow, highly active Viet Cong jungle supply trail located deep inside Phuoc Tuy province. The young American soldiers had been profusely sweating, painfully cramping, violently shivering in the tropical rain and absolutely saying nothing to each other while perfectly maintaining their strict, agonizing noise discipline. They had been strictly ordered by their forward-thinking commanders to completely forget absolutely everything they had previously learned about aggressively charging forward. Instead of making massive tactical noise, they had been trained to essentially become a completely invisible, highly lethal part of the natural jungle scenery instead. 36 grueling hours of having biting tropical insects buzzing directly inside their sensitive ears, thirsty leeches securely attached directly inside their wet combat boots, and their stiff human muscles loudly screaming to simply move and stretch, had ultimately boiled down to this one incredibly tense, highly anticipated, and extremely violent operational moment. Slowly stepping directly out of the suffocating tropical darkness came the incredibly quiet, relaxed murmur of casual human voices. This soft sound was heavily accompanied by the very distinct, rhythmic thud of bare human feet confidently walking directly upon hard-packed earth. Exactly 11 armed enemy figures slowly emerged, marching completely along the narrow dirt trail in a very loose tactical file. They appeared as dark silhouettes, sharply contrasting directly against the very faint pale gray light of the early pre-dawn sky, their heavy military weapons slung completely casually across their shoulders as if they were perfectly safe. These specific enemy fighters were absolutely not men who were currently expecting a sudden, violent military fight. They were essentially just logistics workers traveling directly on a highly familiar, thoroughly utilized supply route, confidently cutting directly through treacherous terrain they mistakenly believed they completely owned and heavily controlled. Standard American conventional forces had loudly swept through this exact same geographic area only 4 days earlier in a massive textbook search and destroy operation and had found absolutely nothing. Consequently, the overarching sense of absolute safety among the local communist guerrillas was almost entirely routine and highly dangerous to their survival. The completely unaware Viet Cong logistics column drifted significantly deeper directly into the highly lethal, entirely unseen American killing zone. They foolishly passed within a few short meters of cold rifle barrels and highly destructive claymore explosives that flawlessly blended directly into the dark tree roots and hanging green vines. When the absolute last enemy man finally stepped completely past the final designated visual reference point, the strict, silent tactical patience of the previous 36 grueling hours spectacularly detonated. In significantly less than one single chaotic minute, a massive, highly coordinated wall of devastating explosive military violence suddenly erupted. A completely solid line of carefully chained claymore explosives violently erupted in a massive, terrifying sheet of jagged steel fragments. This devastating mechanical blast completely tore directly through the unprotected center of the marching enemy formation. In that exact same chaotic heartbeat, dozens of fully automatic military rifles aggressively opened up their deadly fire directly from 3 perfectly concealed surrounding sides. The massive initial burst of heavy tactical fire violently cut completely down the leading and trailing enemy elements before they could even physically raise their slung weapons, totally trapping the terrified survivors in a narrow pocket of absolute destruction. Within exactly 47 chaotic seconds, the entire brutal engagement was completely over. Exactly 11 enemy guerrilla fighters lay completely sprawled dead directly on the bloody dirt trail and deeply tossed into the surrounding thick brush. This massive kill count importantly included a senior company-level communist commander whose highly classified military map case and sensitive logistical papers were later carefully collected completely intact. Incredibly, absolutely not. A single one of Lieutenant Burhoff's perfectly concealed young American soldiers had suffered so much as a slightly ripped uniform sleeve or a minor combat scratch during the entirely one-sided, utterly devastating military ambush. For a completely exhausted infantry platoon that had previously spent agonizing months blindly stumbling directly through entirely empty tropical jungle and foolishly walking directly past highly invisible, cunning enemies, this absolute success felt incredible. This was a completely cold, highly clinical, and deeply satisfying act of long-awaited tactical revenge. The official after-action military paperwork was brutally simple and undeniably clear in its stark conclusions. The specific dirt trail they had perfectly ambushed was the exact same route they had loudly marched completely along 5 separate, highly frustrating times in the previous difficult month without seeing a single enemy fighter. Every single previous time, The listening Viet Cong forces had simply heard them loudly coming from miles away and easily stepped completely aside into the protective green foliage to safely hide. This time, the smart Americans had perfectly done exactly what the seasoned Australian ghosts had strictly preached. They made sure to arrive extremely early, completely shut their mouths, absolutely secure their noisy equipment, and patiently let the unsuspecting target blindly walk directly into the waiting, devastating trap. It initially felt deeply wrong to proud men heavily trained on conventional slogans about aggressive initiative, but the incredible results were absolutely undeniable. This incredibly successful ambush, as deeply impressive as it truly was, represented only the very first violent blow in a much larger, highly psychological strategic shift. After spending long, frustrating months endlessly chasing deeply hidden enemy rice caches, buried weapons dumps, and invisible ammunition trails completely through treacherous swamps and rugged highlands, a highly specialized Joint Allied Intelligence Planning Cell proposed an entirely different, highly cynical tactical approach. Instead of completely exhausting their own valuable troops trying to aggressively find exactly what the Viet Cong had brilliantly hidden, why not intentionally give the greedy enemy forces something very deadly to secretly find? The infamous and highly classified Operation Broken Wing was officially born entirely out of that incredibly cold, almost sadistically cynical military logic. Rather than foolishly hunting an impossible needle in a massive green haystack, the intelligent planners simply decided to willingly hand a completely poisoned needle directly over to the hungry enemy. This specific needle was heavily sharpened in exactly such a highly deceptive way that it would violently cut the enemy's own hand deeply whenever he excitedly tried to utilize it. The underlying psychological concept driving this covert logistical operation was brutally elegant and devastatingly effective against communist morale. Allied intelligence officers absolutely knew that desperate guerrilla units were completely and constantly on the eager lookout for abandoned or slightly damaged military vehicles. These broken trucks might still conveniently contain desperately needed logistical supplies and heavy fuel drums, leftover ration tins, standard small arms ammunition, and even basic mechanical tools left behind after a supposedly hurried American tactical withdrawal were all incredibly prime, highly valued targets for roaming enemy scavenging parties. The devious idea fundamentally driving Operation Broken Wing was to perfectly stage one such incredibly lucrative logistical opportunity in a highly controlled, deeply monitored, and entirely lethal way. Inside the heavily modified cargo bed of the seemingly abandoned transport truck, heavy wooden crates would be haphazardly stacked in highly believable, chaotic disorder. Some authentic crates would legitimately hold perfectly usable, desperately needed food, and a very few completely intact, highly valuable items of standard military gear. However, the other identical crates would secretly contain heavily sabotaged rifle ammunition and incredibly carefully hidden, highly sensitive explosive devices perfectly designed to exact a terrible physical price much later. Far away from the fake accident scene, the dark preparation meticulously took place entirely behind closed doors at a highly secure rear logistics point. Highly skilled armorers and trained explosive specialists meticulously altered selected metal cartridges, intentionally weakening the brass casings and secretly manipulating the internal explosive propellant. This ensured that a small fraction of the dropped rounds would purposefully rupture catastrophically directly inside the weapon's chamber when eventually fired by an enemy. Standard wooden rice crates were also heavily modified so that any rough physical handling with a stolen crowbar or a hard, accidental drop would instantly trigger a very small but incredibly vicious hidden explosive charge. It was completely enough to violently tear completely through the eager hands and faces tightly clustered around them. The primary psychological aim of this dark operation was absolutely not mass physical annihilation occurring entirely on the immediate spot. Instead, it was to intentionally create a terrifying series of sharp, apparently entirely random, bloody tragedies that would completely poison the enemy's fundamental trust in safely capturing Allied military supplies. As these highly terrifying incidents quickly occurred, the chilling story of the treacherous, deadly supply truck on the secondary dirt road rapidly began to circulate widely in terrified whispers among the communist fighters. The massive psychological dividend was absolutely enormous, completely destroying the enemy's critical sense of logistical security and jungle superiority. Every single abandoned supply crate, Every damaged military vehicle and every dropped rifle magazine now carried a terrifying shadow question for the deeply paranoid Viet Cong forces. They constantly asked themselves in fear if this sudden bounty was a highly fortunate tactical blessing or a deadly invisible trap meticulously set by the ghosts. Time and precious manpower that might have easily gone directly into aggressive offensive planning had to be painfully diverted into obsessively checking and rechecking stolen supplies. The invisible hunters were now flawlessly dictating the psychological terms of the brutal jungle war, leading to an inevitable, massive collision. In the driving monsoon rain of August 18, 1966, a small Australian company walked straight into what absolutely should have been a complete military catastrophe. Around 108 exhausted men of Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, aggressively advanced completely through the dark rubber trees. They were located near a contested place called Long Tan in Phuoc Tuy Province, completely unaware of the looming danger. They were casually brushing directly against the heavy forward screen of a vastly larger, highly prepared Viet Cong and North Vietnamese military strike force waiting in the shadows. Later military estimates strongly suggested that up to 2,500 heavily armed enemy troops were violently massed directly in the immediate area. This massive enemy force importantly included elite elements of the 275th Regiment and the deeply entrenched local D-445 Guerrilla Battalion. They were completely ready for a massive, bloody set-piece battle against the vulnerable Western forces. By the cold, unforgiving arithmetic of standard conventional war, the deeply isolated Australians were absolutely not just massively outnumbered on the muddy battlefield, they were essentially already completely written off as tragic, inevitable combat casualties. On any standard military staff table that strictly compared numerical troop figures, the incredibly brave Delta Company utterly belonged directly in the bleak column, firmly marked as lost. The chaotic first combat contacts initially seemed at a quick glance like highly typical, extremely brief jungle skirmishes. Very small groups of armed enemy soldiers suddenly appeared and quickly melted completely away between the wet rubber trees, aggressively testing the quick tactical reaction of the advancing Australian patrol. Then the incredibly heavy enemy fire massively intensified from all surrounding sides, trapping the isolated men completely in the mud. The terrifying volume of tactical movement rapidly increased completely on their exposed flanks, and the torrential tropical rain coming heavily down in utterly solid gray sheets quickly turned the entire dark plantation into a blinding, terrifying blur of shattered tree trunks and lethal shadows. The trapped Australians instantly understood with terrible crystal clarity that they were being systematically, completely encircled by a vastly superior enemy combat force. Desperately pulling rapidly back in blind panic completely across the deadly open ground would absolutely only feed the aggressive communist attackers a steady, tragic stream of completely isolated, highly vulnerable human targets. The only viable tactical alternative to absolute destruction was to courageously stand incredibly fast under heavy fire. They had to quickly form a completely tight, highly disciplined defensive perimeter directly within the exposed plantation rows, heavily relying entirely on their brutal training, absolute fire discipline, and massive artillery support. To effectively do what raw numbers loudly dictated was totally impossible. It was a classic, terrifying textbook last stand scenario, aggressively played completely out in real, agonizing time, completely under suffocating mud, freezing water, and thousands of incoming enemy rounds aggressively tearing through the thin tropical air around them. They rapidly dug extremely shallow defensive positions directly among the shattered rubber trees and perfectly set up highly coordinated, interlocking fields of deadly defensive fire. They were meticulously husbanding their limited military ammunition and strictly refusing to foolishly waste precious rifle rounds on dark, ambiguous shapes they could absolutely not clearly identify in the pouring tropical rain. Crucially, their brave forward observers continuously stayed directly on the crackling military radio, frantically talking directly to incredibly accurate batteries of distant New Zealand and Australian artillery guns located several muddy kilometers away that could barely physically see a single thing. These distant Allied artillery batteries could perfectly calculate exactly where devastating explosive shells were desperately needed. As massive enemy infantry formations constantly tried to violently build completely up for overwhelming human wave assaults just barely beyond the limited visible line of shattered tree trunks, the skilled artillery officers continuously dropped incredibly heavy, highly explosive barrages. They flawlessly placed these terrifying explosive rings incredibly tight directly around the highly vulnerable Australian company, expertly walking the massive wall of deadly fire continuously in and rapidly out by mere tens of perilous meters as the chaotic, bloody battlefield situation constantly shifted. Each terrifying time, massive assault groups aggressively emerged completely from the blinding monsoon gloom to violently push directly forward. They were brutally met by a highly precise, utterly devastating combination of accurate small arms fire and perfectly timed artillery shell bursts that completely shredded their aggressive forward momentum. The brutal, close-quarters battle agonizingly dragged completely on for roughly 3 to 4 terrifying hours, an absolute lifetime for the entirely soaked, thoroughly exhausted young men standing knee-deep in bloody mud and fighting directly under near-continuous, overwhelming lethal threat, while their vital combat ammunition completely ran incredibly low. When the terrifying storm of explosive fire finally eased and the deeply battered enemy forces slowly began to strategically disengage, the horrific scene directly around Delta Company looked exactly like something entirely from a bloody nightmare. The incredibly brave Australians had tragically suffered 18 good men lost and 24 heavily wounded. It was a highly savage physical toll for exactly such an incredibly small tactical unit, but it fell incredibly far, completely short of the total, absolute annihilation that had strongly seemed so completely certain when the massive first human waves aggressively hit them in the pouring rain. Formal battlefield counts, and much later strategic assessments, strongly suggested at least 245 enemy personnel were successfully neutralized, with vastly many more violently dragged, completely away, heavily wounded, or missing entirely in the dark jungle. The incredibly rare combination of strict ghost school fieldcraft, absolute fire discipline, and highly ruthless artillery coordination had miraculously turned a totally guaranteed potential military disaster directly into a grim, highly improbable tactical success. Yet even this legendary, epic, defensive stand was absolutely only one specific, violent facet of a much wider, completely quiet strategic revolution taking place. Captured communist military documents found directly in subsequent combat operations loudly told a highly parallel, deeply fascinating story, completely from the terrified other side. Internal enemy combat directives and secret briefings rapidly began to carefully single completely out these specific Australian-style tactical units as an entirely unique, highly lethal battlefield threat. One former Viet Cong company leader, carefully interviewed many long years later, perfectly summed completely up the new, creeping terror in incredibly blunt, honest terms. He stated it took absolutely no more than 15 short minutes of initial violent contact to deeply know the absolute truth. He claimed they instantly knew if they were violently up against standard, completely predictable foreign troops or the truly dangerous, entirely invisible ones. This incredibly growing mutual respect and deep lingering anxiety heavily festering among the enemy combat ranks heavily highlighted a very bitter, inescapable historical irony that would utterly dominate the final, bloody years of the entire conflict. At the micro-tactical level, completely in the dark rubber plantations, isolated rural hamlets, and narrow jungle supply tracks, the specialized Western forces had brilliantly discovered exactly how to perfectly turn the harsh environment into a highly lethal ally. However, at the absolute macro-strategic level, completely in safe political capitals and highly secure defense ministries located incredibly far away directly from the bloody front line, the overarching political and military strategic framework remained utterly, fatally confused and deeply flawed. The massive, highly televised Tet Offensive of January 1968 completely shattered crucial public confidence back in the United States that any actual strategic progress was truly being officially made. The raw tactical excellence happening directly at the absolute sharpest edge of the bloody spear was unfortunately being heavily bought completely with incredible blood and brilliance. Sadly, this incredible tactical success was absolutely not being successfully converted directly into any lasting strategic military momentum. The tragic overarching story circles completely back, absolutely inevitably, to that terrifying, tense opening image entirely from August 1966, involving an exhausted American infantry platoon completely frozen deeply in the tall elephant grass. They were absolutely ready to violently charge exactly what they foolishly thought was a completely panicked, heavily fleeing enemy scout. Staff Sergeant Thomas Grady and his 40 brave men had absolutely no terrified idea they were mere seconds completely away from violently dying. They were blindly walking directly into a perfectly prepared, highly lethal enemy kill zone, but exactly 300 meters completely away, perfectly hidden directly in the dense bamboo, the highly observant Australian captain simply picked completely up his heavy military radio. He urgently warned the naive American company commander and rapidly redirected the vulnerable platoon directly to a completely different, highly secure tactical position exactly where they could expertly set entirely up a devastating ambush of their very own design. 2 quiet days later, a combined Allied strike force completely caught that exact same communist unit. They caught them completely in the wide open and violently tore the enemy completely apart with absolutely overwhelming, highly accurate fire poured directly from perfect concealment. Exactly 17 enemy guerrilla fighters absolutely did not survive to return completely from that highly devastating military engagement, and there were absolutely zero Allied combat losses suffered. Sergeant Thomas Grady thankfully lived to fight another day. He successfully completed his brutal combat tour and strongly extended his military time directly in country, specifically to aggressively learn and carefully pass completely on the highly effective new ghost tracking and ambush techniques. Years later, he would openly admit the smart Australians had clearly shown him he was fighting backwards. That massive reversal completely from blindly charging directly into the dark jungle to brilliantly making the deep jungle forcefully bring the vulnerable enemy directly to you securely stands as an incredible, highly sharp tactical lesson. It proves even a massive, incredibly loud military machine can eventually learn to fight quietly. But the brutal war unfortunately slipped completely away directly into the tragic category. History sadly reserved strictly for incredibly brilliant fighters completely failed by a fatally blurred, totally incoherent strategy.